We are going to continue our study with Lesson 2 on the messianic and eschatological significance of the afikomen and the third and fourth cup at the Passover Seder. Now, the bread and the afikomen, the bread being the matzah. I mentioned last lesson that today what the Jewish world does at their Passover celebration, the Seder, is they have a matzah bag, 3 compartments. Each compartment has a board of matzah. And the middle board is pulled out early in the evening by the leader of the Seder. It is broken in half. The larger piece of matzah is then wrapped in a linen napkin and is referred to as the afikomen. What I didn't mention last lesson is that it's hidden in the home somewhere, and the children will go look for it and bring it back after the meal, and the finder of it gets a gift. Now, for a better explanation, more in-depth explanation, you'll have to look at another one of our classes that we offer on understanding Christ in the Passover. But I just want to give you that little bit of background of the afikomen and what it is today. Now, 2,000 years ago, Jesus clearly celebrated a Passover. It was a Seder. And we are told in Matthew chapter 26, verse 26, "And as they were eating, Jesus took bread and blessed it and broke it and gave it to the disciples and said, 'Take, eat, this is my body.'" Now, Passover Seder. The previous lesson I mentioned that Seder means order. And the order of the Passover is the same today as it was at the time of Jesus and even prior to his celebrating the Passover. What has changed is the elements on the table. But when we are told in this gospel account, "and as they were eating," we know it's in roughly the middle part of the evening of the celebration. "And Jesus took bread," matzah. That would have been, I believe, the afikomen. Now, the highlight of the entire Passover Seder is the drama surrounding the afikomen. That's certainly true today, certainly for the children present, because as that afikomen is hid in the home, children will excitedly look for it, hoping to find it, hoping to get that gift. The destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 70 AD certainly had a major impact on the form of the Passover and the afikomen. The birth of Christianity as well, the surrounding culture at the time, the Jewish people being in diaspora, dispersion after 70 AD, all played a role in the way Passover evolved. And Passover has evolved down through the years. Again, if you remember from Lesson 1, there are only 3 items on the original Passover table, Exodus 12. The lamb, the unleavened bread, and the bitter herbs. At the time of Jesus, we have the juice on the table. And today there are many additional items that we are not going to look at in these lessons. What we are told about this by Chaim Raphael. He wrote a book titled A Feast of History, The Drama of Passover Through the Ages. And he said this: "The Seder," that's the order of the Passover. Whenever the Jewish people just refer to Seder, they're always referring to the Passover and the order of the celebration. The Seder was more sharply defined in its present form in the century after the destruction of the temple, say between 100 and 150 of the Common Era, that's AD. And so this Jewish writer recognizes that after the destruction of Jerusalem, the temple, the nation of Israel in 70 AD, the practice of the Passover, the form of the Seder, was changed by necessity. He recognizes that. Because again, no temple. When the temple was standing, you would bring the lamb to the temple, sacrifice it, bring it back to the home. You would eat it that night, and that would be the meal around the remembrance of the Exodus out of Egypt. But now things have changed. And they changed, according to Raphael, somewhere between 100 and 150 AD. The origin of the Afikomen ritual is certainly ancient, most likely predating the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Jewish scholar David Daub argues persuasively that this is the case. In other words, that the Afikomen predates 70 AD and the destruction of the temple. He argues persuasively, I believe persuasively, that this is the case. In his writings about this, the importance of his writings is the establishment of the Afikomen with messianic identification. Now, the Afikomen today on the table, in present Jewry's celebration, the Afikomen represents the lamb, but according to the rabbis, it also represents the Messiah. Daub says that his research shows that the Afikomen was on the table prior to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD and represented the Messiah. Now, the following quotes of Daub come from a written version of his address at St. Paul's lecture founded by the London Diocesan Council for Christian Jewish Understanding. He says this: "The decisive framework for a messianic ritual is there in the early sources." He says it's clear that there was a messianic understanding of the ritual around the Afikomen prior to 70 AD. Michael Moore wrote an article titled "The Mystery of the Middle Matzah." Now remember, the middle matzah is removed, broken in half, the larger piece wrapped in a linen napkin. That linen napkin is then known as the Afikomen. It's hid somewhere in the house. After the meal, the children will look for it. The finder brings it back to the leader and gets a gift. So the article he wrote, titled "The Mystery of the Middle Matzah," in the Christian Witness to Israel publication, the Spring Herald, in 2010, he writes this: "In 1925, the German scholar Robert Eisler proposed that the Afikomen was part of the Passover observed by Jews at the time of Jesus, and that the broken matzah represented the Messiah. Eisler's thesis was opposed by both Jewish and Christian scholars and was largely forgotten until 1966, when David Daub, a Jewish scholar at Oxford University, revived it and produced further documentation to support Eisler's theory. Daub argued that the term Afikomen was derived from the Greek word afikomenos, meaning the coming one, or he who has come, and that the coming one was none other than the Messiah. The article goes on. Further confirmation for Eisler's theory had emerged in the 1930s, when a remarkable Greek document called Peripascha, on the Passover, was discovered. written by Melito, the 2nd century bishop of Sardis. The biblical scholar Frank Moore Cross described Pascha as, quote, nothing less than a Christian Passover Haggadah, close quote. And in it, Melito twice refers to Jesus as the one who is coming, aphakomen, out of heaven to the earth. Now, the point I want you to see here is not these so-called biblical scholars, as certainly Cross, for example, is very liberal. But the point I want you to see is the identification of the aphakomen matzah, representing the Messiah, being present on the Passover table prior to 70 A.D. Even the meaning of the word aphakomen, it's a Greek word, not Hebrew, it's Greek, argues for the messianic understanding of this routine. Quoting again from Dobb, he says, the Greek aphakomenos, being what in Greek grammar is termed an aorist, denotes he that came, or has come, rather than he that comes, or shall come. To understand why this rendering was chosen, it would be necessary to probe into the messianic timescale of the translators. And so, did the translators believe the Messiah has already come, meaning speaking of Jesus, or he's coming in the future? Well, he's arguing that in the aorist, it's past tense, he has come, and so it represents the one who has come already. Now, the common Jewish explanation of the meaning of this word, aphakomen, is either dessert or entertainment. Dobb questions this understanding. Moore, in his article, comments on Dobb's understanding and says this. In a lecture entitled, He That Comes, given at St. Paul's Cathedral, under the auspices of the London Diocesan Council for Christian Jewish Understanding, Dobb set forth the case that the unleavened bread Jesus gave to his disciples at the Last Supper was the aphakomen. When Jesus announced, "This is my body," said Dobb, he was making use of an existing prophetic tradition to reveal himself as the Messiah. According to Dobb, the messianic symbolism was eventually lost, deliberately distorted, or possibly suppressed by rabbinic authorities, giving rise to the later interpretations of the word as a dessert or an after-dinner entertainment. So Dobb argues that there was a messianic understanding of the aphakomen prior to 70 A.D. After 70 A.D., the aphakomen is still present in the Jewish practice, but that the meaning of the aphakomen was changed to speak of either dessert or entertainment, and possibly deliberately distorted or suppressed. Now, we can understand why. Because if it represented the Messiah, with the entire illustration of today's table of the matzah bag and the aphakomen, it decidedly points back to Jesus. And no tie-in like that could be allowed by the rabbinic authorities who reject the messiahship of Jesus. But this is a Jewish man, Dobb, who's just trying to deal with the evidence and says it was there prior to 70 A.D., the aphakomen. So when Jesus picked up the bread and said, "Take, eat, this is my body," he was not giving new meaning to the Passover. In this case, the bread. We celebrate this as the communion, the Lord's table. But he was using the existing understanding that this bread, the aphakomen, which represented the Messiah, is actually symbolic, representing him, as he is the Messiah of Israel. So Jesus did not pick up that bread and give new meaning to it, saying, this now represents my body. He picked up that bread, the afikomen, which represented the Messiah, and said, take, eat, this is my body. And it's a claim to messiahship, that he is the Messiah of Israel. So it's not a new meaning. It's picking up a tradition that was on the table, that the Jewish people celebrated, and ascribing that, understanding that this represents the Messiah. I am he, the Messiah of Israel, Jesus was saying. The Jewish believers at that table would have understood clearly what Jesus was claiming. He is the Messiah of Israel. There's a clear messianic understanding of the afikomen. And after 70 AD, when things changed, the celebration of the Passover changed, the afikomen was still present, but it comes to the participants in a completely different way than prior to 70 AD, when it was probably just on the table and referred to as the afikomen. After 70 AD, a whole different tradition arose that you find in the Jewish world even today. And that afikomen does represent the Messiah. Jesus was claiming, I am the Messiah of Israel. Next lesson, we will look at the juice, the cups of wine, their history, their meaning, and what we learn from this, and the uniqueness of the third and the fourth cup of juice at Jesus' Passover Seder. Until next time, shalom.